So these are about global issues raised by modernity. We're not going back unless we're punished back into the Stone Age by our own foolishness. That unfortunately is maybe a real concern at the moment or in the last little while. But the issue, one way of framing the issue is that winners defined what losers lose. And so it's more than a social justice issue. Yes, it's a social justice issue, but could we achieve social justice without thinking seriously about our mechanisms, our institutions, our approaches, our theories, our philosophy about governance? We've been here before. I'm old enough to remember the early discussions in the northeastern US about acid rain, coal-fired power plants dripping from Ohio and Iowa even, dripping acid into the Adirondacks, which were my hometowns. Climate extremes. We very well know that climate extremes are visited upon people who weren't the major causes of those extremes. Sea level rise, likewise. So those are some of the issues. A lot of this depends on your point of view, and my favorite example in this area has to do with our food supply. So we in the West, we in America, we in Europe, eat from a global plate. I imagine it'll quite surprise most of you to learn that only 10% of the world's food, and it's entirely grains, with a few fruits in there, actually are traded internationally. Which means that 90% of the food that people eat is food produced locally, or at least regionally. And this has been true for decades. And it's probably more true today than it was in the 60s or the 50s or even the 40s because the population was so much lower back then. Changing weather patterns dramatically affect global food production. Rain, water, weather systems, storms, heat. So while locavore is an idea that's new to New Jersey and new to the Northeast and new to America and new maybe even to Europe, it's the fact of life for the other 7 billion people on Earth. And the same goes for fisheries. We eat fish from all over, but people who eat fish, the other 7 billion people who eat fish that's local. So I think there's a huge issue here. It's a fascinating, deep, political, academic, intellectual issue, opportunity. And if I'm right, then it seems to me, since these are, as I see them, mostly environmental issues, this school at Rutgers should be in the forefront of promoting work to advance improvements in mechanisms for governance. If there are others who are already thinking about this elsewhere, I would hope political science might be, but I've looked and I don't see it.
They were invited.
And I also think, fine, I also think that there is an enormous pent-up interest, potentially an interest, I believe this is true, of wealthy people who are big enough to think about these issues and would come forward with the right kind of opportunity to invest in a serious focus on governance. And that we could lead that. It did not show up in the Big Ideas campaign, but there's room for that still going forward. I would adopt it as a Big Ideas capital campaign initiative for this school. I would challenge this department, human ecology, to think seriously about its priorities and whether or not this is something that ought to be undertaken. And I'm not being directive, I'm just trying to raise an opportunity. I think it's super important and is something that we should tackle. So that's my piece. Sorry for taking a bit longer than you probably planned. But again, I'm looking forward to hearing what I hear tonight.
Hi, I'm Karen O'Neill. I don't have slides, so I'll just be speaking to you. So let me talk a little bit about, I'm a sociologist by training, a political sociologist, historical, and several of us, I think, sort of come with a sociological perspective, but others do not. And I wanted to talk first about what we mean by governance. So the term governance is actually in circulation in environmental circles, primarily because it's been used at the international level. So I believe Cymie Payne will speak to this issue specifically. What it means in terms of the history of, I guess, political science and political sociology is that historically we've always looked at how political power has been organized, and for the last 500 years more or less, it's been organized primarily around the modern state. And the modern state is the entity that Robert Goodman was talking about. It's the dividing up the world into geographically defined spaces that are controlled by a sort of political claimant. And that political claimant, primarily the claim over that land is based in coercion. So the distinctive thing about the modern state is that it's control over territory as opposed to control over people. So previous forms of political authority had controlled specific people. We can think about that in terms of empires and the like. So empires tend to think in terms of which peoples do we control. And so, of course, the modern state has mix of that sort of thing when we see nationalist movements, right? So that sort of is it's not a pure thing. But that's the distinctive difference, is the territorial control. Okay, we know plenty of places in the world where that territorial control is very incomplete. And so we talk about failed states or something like that. So we can think about the drug cartels in Mexico that lead to enforcement problems. Well, environmental issues in global commons areas like the oceans or the air are also essentially not state spaces, and how do we regulate them? So I think we're going to see that theme coming out through several of the different concepts that we're talking about today. I think we see it really clearly in fisheries. So fisheries has been one of the areas, and I know my colleagues will talk about that, where people have thought about this in a quite sophisticated fashion. So that's the backdrop. And so in terms of government and state making, right, that would be centered in those sort of formal states. And governance includes non-state actors. And so some of these are fairly formal arrangements. So if we think about cap and trade arrangements that include quasi-markets, those are forms of governance, right? They may or may not be controlled by a modern state. They may be, some of these are created by the industry players themselves. So that's a form of governance. We think in terms of sustainability initiatives that are also done within, say, individual corporations. That's a form of governance. Community groups, grassroots efforts, those can be forms of governance. Rutgers sustainability policies are forms of governance. Student groups, etc. So all these things. So that's just to kind of give us the overview, and I think my colleagues will have other things to add to that. So I'm going to speak about my own work in coastal climate adaptation. And one of the reasons why this is kind of interesting for talking about climate change is that this is the first sort of obvious indicator of climate change is being experienced in terms of sea level rise and coastal change. We understand that there are signals, and personally I'm more concerned about signals in agricultural systems as regards to what Dean Goodman was saying, right? But it's less obvious. It's more apparent with sea level rise that we have this threat. It's visual, it's visceral, and people have started to make, and actually have been making for quite some time, connections between individual storms and climate change, even before the scientists necessarily did attributions. So I think it's an early test of governance. And so the practices that we're observing in coastal management are building on existing formal and informal practices. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some research that I'm doing in that. regard. So what are coastal climate governance approaches? Well, you can either build barriers, and so we're used to that, levees, seawalls, and the like. You can build accommodations, which is raising your houses and other things up on stilts, allowing places to be flooded, or you can move. And what we often see is recommendations by climate modelers showing a projection of how many acres, how many square miles are, subject to inundation, and then there's a sort of statement that millions of people will have to move, right? And this is like the introduction of the article, and then they go ahead with their models, and it's like, well, how is that going to happen, right? And so one of the problems with this is that we understand climate modeling had to be done at a global level in order to capture the global climate, and yet that framing is a bit of a ball and chain for us now. We've committed to framing climate change as a global scale issue. And so this is what I call, geographers have called a scale frame, and I'm going to use this concept of the scale frame. How are we framing problems? And so the global scale is too strongly emphasized still. If we're talking about coastal adaptation, we know that the conditions are actually going to vary quite a bit from place to place. So the decisions about what you actually do in a particular coastal site are really local. And it's not just that they're not about global treaties, it's that they're land use decisions. And land use decisions are made by some of the most, well, let's just say, conservative and not innovative institutions, right? So decisions about development, the default policy around the world is still to develop the shore, period, end of sentence. There's just, this is true for wealthy countries as well as poor countries. So that's the default policy. They're not even really talking about possibly retreat, let alone, building accommodations or the like. And so in some countries, national governments are involved in, this idea of coastal management, but you really only see a coordination even between that higher level national decision-making and the local decision-making in countries like Vietnam, China, and Cuba. In other countries, the local level is still making the land use decisions. And so a sense of crisis, though, may be merging in some places like the Jersey Shore, where you have high-value real estate. There's been long-term efforts to really fix the shore into place, both legally and physically, right? So legally in terms of property rights and physically in terms of barrier protections. But in other places, we don't see that sense of crisis maybe as much. And so in the Pacific Islands in particular, people there have been pushing back against the climate doom scenarios and often represent themselves as people who've always moved. It's a very interesting pushback. And this actually goes along with the sovereignty issue because some of their leaders, Dean Goodman was mentioning sovereignty, some of their leaders are saying we're going to have to move our entire country, like Kiribati, into Fiji. And so now there's this whole legal enterprise of figuring out what do you do with a deterritorialized state. Is that possible? Can you just... So the people are having none of it, right? So most of the people living in these countries are just not accepting that idea. So the research that I'm going to just finish with is a project I'm doing with Heather Fennick and Shannon Kaplan, and we're looking at cases of people moving away from the shore around the world. This is the answer to, well, how are people going to do it? And what we're finding is that people are using those existing land use strategies and then they're adapting them. We're not seeing a lot of novelty. So this is very important, again, for sociology. We're always concerned about existing institutions. So the two approaches that people mostly use are migration and managed retreat, so these concepts you've heard about. What's important for us is that migration is decided at the individual and household level, is usually not supported by broader institutions. So the scale frame here, the concern is that it's been framed as a problem that's suffered by the individuals, the people who are being most affected by the new threats, and they're bearing the cost. The idea of managed retreat is widely discussed, and yet we find fewer cases than the media would lead you to expect. Managed retreat implies that it's managed, phased in over time, that it's carefully dealt with and it's supported. And when we started looking at cases, we realized we needed another category, which we call emergency retreat. And this happens after tsunamis, after typhoons and the like. And some of these we've seen actually very interesting forms of organization to take, use a crisis, right? Use that crisis and then set policies that maybe will encourage people to move back. Extremely hard to accomplish this in some of the most vulnerable countries where people are quite poor and they're moving back. So at Taliban, for example, people just unfortunately moved back even though the government tried to move them on. And so what we try to highlight here is that partly there's this disconnect between scales and there's this sense that you're not acting in advance of harm. So this emergency retreat or emergency migration is a real threat. We identify a couple of other strategies. The other one that I think is of interest is called en-bloc relocation, which is when, if you've heard about the Alaskan native villages, those are proposing to move intact. And this is mostly by groups that consider themselves culturally distinctive. It's really ambitious. What we think is really important to highlight there is that they're saying not only do people move, but they have to move somewhere. And so that's the only strategy that's developing where people really are identifying where that relocation site will be. So this is slowly becoming of interest within the migration field as well. Where are people moving to? So at any rate, to sum up our concerns is that there's a mismatch in scales in terms of the way the problem has been framed by science, by international organizations, and then who's actually doing the moving. And again, if you leave it to the household level and the individual level, you are putting the onus on people who are suffering directly and you're not supporting them.
Great. Well, I'm Pam McElwee. I'm also in human ecology, the same as Karen. And I want to talk a little bit about the importance of the way we frame what the environment is as a form of governance, so our definitions. And one of the things that I've been working on in recent years is thinking about the concept of ecosystem services as a way of defining the environment, and then what are the consequences of that definition for the governance regimes that might follow. So ecosystem services has become a very sort of trendy approach. It's been very popular over the last few years, particularly in the last decade since the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was completed in 2005. And essentially ecosystem services are just the benefits that humans receive from ecosystems. That's the broadest definition of them. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is well known for having divided ecosystem services up into various categories ranging from provisioning services, regulation and maintenance services, cultural services, basically acknowledging there's a suite of benefits that we get from ecosystems. So this idea of ecosystem services has really taken off in the academic literature. So there were only 128 academic articles in the 1990s, the whole decade of the 1990s, talking about ecosystem services. And then from 2000 to 2010, there were 2,500 articles. In 2017 alone, there were 3,500 articles. So this is clearly a term that's sticking. And it's been a term that's been taken up by various policy forums as well, so most notably the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is a UN governmental body which has been assessing the state of both biodiversity and ecosystem services, and I've been a part of it for the last 3 years. And one of the things that we've been tasked with is thinking about governance. If we're going to use this term of ecosystem services, what are the particular governance models that might result from that? The most obvious, and I think the one that people recognize the most, is this idea of payments for ecosystem services, or PES. This idea that one sets up some sort of transaction, whoever's benefiting from the ecosystem service has to pay the provider of the ecosystem service. So a classic example, downstream hydropower company pays upstream forest providers or forest protectors. But there's other potential ways in which governance models or policies could use ecosystem services that are less well known. So it's entirely possible, for example, that environmental impact assessments can start using ecosystem services as a term. Carbon offsetting, that's something that relates to ecosystem services. Natural capital accounting, moving away from GDP measures and more towards the idea of natural capital as assets. So there's a lot of places where we could potentially use ecosystem services as a tool to define the realm of the environment. But I would argue there's not been nearly as much work on the governance aspect of ecosystem services as there has been on defining what they are and trying to measure them in various ways. So it's been really dominated by the ecologists, talking about, well, what are the measures that we would particularly use to, say, measure the ecosystem services provided by pollinators. It's also been dominated by economists. How do we actually value some of these ecosystem services? But there's been much less attention to the governance aspects. So how does ecosystem services, for example, relate to public versus private goods provision? Because we can think about a lot of ecosystem services that can go either way. Water being a good example. It can be provided by private entities, it can be provided by public entities, and both can benefit. So there's a giant realm of interest in how do we govern ecosystem services that's going to be, I think, really taking off over the next few years. And so this is something that particularly interests me in the context of my research, because there's been basically a debate between critical social scientists, and in this category I would say anthropologists, geographers, sociologists, and so forth, versus economists and ecologists. Like, what should we do with ecosystem services as a concept? So a lot of critical social scientists have said, this is another form of neoliberalization. This is marketization of the environment. It's moving away from state regulatory control and more towards privatization. So this idea that ecosystem services is kind of a slippery slope towards excess dependency on the market to regulate the environment. Versus the economists who have basically said, well, this is one of the best tools that we might have to try to value non-market benefits that people are receiving from ecosystems. And so this debate has played out between these two camps, particularly around how widespread are these concepts, are they influencing policy, what's going on? So the critical social scientists have basically said, these are hegemonic, they're all over the place, we got to fight against them. The ecologists and economists have basically said, we actually don't see all that much change in terms of policy now that we talk about ecosystem services. And so my interest is, well, who's right? Like, where are we? And so I, just a few weeks ago, found out I'm getting an NSF grant to look at this in the region of Southeast Asia. And it'll be particularly interesting because Southeast Asia has a lot of really unique characteristics. It has, and we're going to look at all the countries of Southeast Asia, so we've got multiple case studies. But it's got really unique characteristics of a lot of very interesting topography, so very high mountains, lots of coastal cities dependent on water provisioning from those high mountains. Lots of conflicts between cultural groups over whose rights to nature might trump others. So I think it's going to be a really interesting place to explore these questions. And what we're going to do in this project, and I've got collaborators in the region, is do a series of interviews both with policymakers but also with local communities and watersheds, and look at this question of how are people using ecosystem services? How is it changing policy, if at all? And what are the types of ecosystem services that are getting into policy and which ones aren't? Does that all allow us to ask some really interesting questions about how does the concept of ecosystem services get inserted into policy realms? Where is it coming from? Is it just sort of a Western imposition, or is it sort of, are there organically produced ideas in Southeast Asia that are unique to Southeast Asia? We're going to look at the metrics. How are ecosystem services being measured in different countries? We're going to look at how ecosystem services have been valued and financialized. So where payments have been put in place, what accounts for the range of differences in valuation across the region. So water is not going to be valued the same in the same monetary measures in different places. And we particularly want to know about those ecosystem services that are not commodified, that cannot be monetarily valued. A good example in Southeast Asia is nobody's figured out how to deal with pollination as an ecosystem service. That we know it provides huge economic benefits, but how would we actually commodify that in terms of payments? Nobody's figured that out yet. So we want to ask, is there something materially different about certain ecosystem services that makes it really hard to value? What's going on? So this regional comparison will allow us to do that. And finally, we want to know, what's the level of participation in all of these processes? Is this being driven by sort of elites and scientists and top-down, or is there a genuine space for people on the ground in watersheds to have their own ideas of nature and the value of ecosystems, and can that filter up into the policy realm? So I'm really excited to be working on this project. I think it's going to be a really interesting way to look at these various governance issues that Karen and Dean Goodman and Rachel had all talked about. And I think, like Dean Goodman said, SEPS is a place where we can ask these questions and hopefully come up with innovative answers. So, okay, thank you.
So may I just say to everybody?
Yes.
Watch the news on Tuesday.
Oh, yes.
To come up here.
Watch the news.
So that will be a different project.
Isn't it there already?
Thank you.
I think of
Just if you want to change slides, you can use this.
Oh, brilliant. That's very helpful. Yes, okay. Let's see. We'll see how this goes. Yes, good, okay. Okay, and I have to say that above all, I appreciate the highly collaborative nature of this whole gathering here, which Olaf has just signally improved my life by providing a clicker. So, which hopefully works, yes, thank you. So I'm Cymie Payne. I'm a member of the Department of Human Ecology, and I'm thrilled that we're talking about this. I'm going to talk about, let's see, this is hopefully it works for it. There we go, brilliant. Okay. So we're living in an era where science and technology have dramatically changed our relationship to the oceans. They were, in the past, remote, dangerous to be in, and it wasn't that economically interesting to go out to the high seas areas. But that's changed radically. The blue economy promises to further scale up our activities in the high seas. So my focus on this is going to be looking at the high seas from the depths of more than 5,000 meters below the ocean to places like the Sargasso Sea where the seahorse lives, a floating mat of sargassum weed in the Atlantic Ocean, through the legal lens, and thinking about also policy and international relations. So the high seas is defined legally as the ocean more than 200 miles from shore, roughly speaking. It constitutes nearly half of the surface of the planet. At best, governments can regulate the activities of their nationals when they're in the high seas, primarily through registering ships. They don't have territorial jurisdiction there. So the background that Karen gave us was super helpful because it should help us realize this is a very different context from traditional governance situations. Given the complications, the remoteness, the complexity, and the lack of jurisdiction, we have to think about how we're going to deal with these things. And you'll see some of these pictures coming back. But in short, with technology, with burgeoning populations, and actually national pride is a factor here. The calculus of whether to be in the high seas and whether we need governance there has changed because we are increasingly harming the high seas and the environment there. And these activities are increasingly in conflict with each other. So I want to start out with the need. An example of that is submarine cables. Submarine cables provide 90% of our international internet communications. And the map in the corner highlights the fact that for some island states like Guam, they are absolutely dependent on it. Guess what? So is Australia and New Zealand. They're absolutely dependent on it. The cloud is not above us. It is in the bottom of the ocean. Yeah. However, they have a problem because deep sea mining leases have been issued by the International Seabed Authority in areas where submarine cables need to cross. And some of the concessionaires have refused to say that they'll respect and create pathways and stay away from those areas. So the submarine cables folks were not interested in talking with the program that I'm about to describe until this came up as an issue. And now they're getting a little more interested. Illegal fishing on the high seas is a huge problem. Technology is helping us start to get a handle on it. This is the Thunder. It was a trawler that was pursued for illegal fishing across more than 10,000 nautical miles, across 2 seas and 3 oceans by the Sea Shepherd. Guess what? The Sea Shepherd is a non-governmental organization, which itself is considered a pirate organization. That's the Sea Shepherd ship. They nonetheless managed to go after the Thunder because they are doing it for the environment. So scientists, diplomats, and ocean policy wonks recognize that really it's no longer possible to have this gapping governance on the high seas. Yeah, this is my brag shot. This was from the last meeting a couple weeks ago at the UN. But a lot of the people here I've been working on this for the last 3 years. There are people in this room who have been working on this since the 1990s, since the Law of the Sea Convention came into force. And they've been working towards trying to get a convention to govern the high seas. So the negotiation is taking place at the United Nations in New York. It's perfectly possible for the Rutgers community to come as observers and see the proceedings. It's going to become more difficult to actually intervene as I'm doing here. I'm there with the International Union for Conservation of Nature. I'm a legal advisor to their delegation. And what I'm talking about, as fate would have it, is exactly the points that Pam was raising about the problems if you have, say you do a project and you're going to do something on the high seas, and you try to minimize and mitigate and avoid harms if there's residual harm. Is there going to be financial compensation for that? So some of the treaty language that we were looking at would have suggested financial compensation was fine. And I was presenting IUCN's policy recommendations, work on that says no, it has to be environmental conservation values that are equivalent to what's been lost. Very challenging in the high seas. I'm going to skip over what the sort of guts of the treaty are in the interest of hearing my very interesting colleagues speak instead of just talking. So I want to turn a little bit to the question of the role of science. So we need to design an institutional architecture. We've figured out that there's a need. We need to choose an institutional architecture. It could look like this: conference of parties, secretariat, clearinghouse mechanism, scientific advisory bodies, kind of thing. What is the scientific role here? This is for the stuff that I'm skipping. Well, the delegates have all agreed, whether they're from Palau and Nauru, little tiny Pacific Island states, or they're from China, the US, Europe. Everyone agrees that it should be science-based. What does that mean? Most of the people in the room, I got to tell you, aren't scientists. So most of the people in the room don't know what it means. And what they do understand, I think we all understand, is that there are difficult political choices that have to be made, and that we have to strike the right balance between the best science that rationally tells us and the difficult political choices. So one of the questions could be, will scientists, like the ocean observation teams here at Rutgers, be able to provide information for environmental impact assessments? Are they going to do it in their personal capacity? Or are they going to serve on review panels, as many here do, county, who's going to support that? And is it going to be well represented nationally, or is it going to be all countries like the United States that can afford to send people to those panels? There's a realm of questions around that. There's a lot of dispute about how that's going to be done. There's a strong preference. I thought I put Crab up. He's a deep sea crab, but he reflects the attitudes. So some argue that scientists should have a strong role, a strong decision-making role. Most countries do not want scientists to have a decision-making role. They say national governments should retain control over what their nationals can and can't do in the global commons of the sea. Others demand a strong civil society role. And the risk governance framework that Rachael Shwom and I wrote about in our paper on geoengineering actually considers that all of these groups do have an important role in governance, but here how to do that. Olaf Jensen participates in a U.S. fisheries management program that gives a strong role to the scientific and statistical committee that he serves on by constraining political decision makers within the bounds set by their expertise. These may be models for scientific bodies within the treaty, but different national approaches make this a very sensitive issue. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that the institutional architecture to solve the problem we have is going to end up being embodied in treaty text. And that is the phase that we're about to go into. We actually have to choose the right words that are sufficiently constrained, we can get real obligations, sufficiently flexible to adapt to changing circumstances, new information, innovation, and that strike the right balance between political necessity, justice, and scientific rationality. So I'm really pleased to be able to learn from all of you how we can do this. Thank you.
Okay. Olaf. Okay. Oh, is it on the desktop? No.
It's right there.
Oh, it is that one. Okay. That. Got it. Okay.
Great. So let me start off by saying I'm really excited to be here in this conversation. This is not a conversation that I typically get to have with other fisheries scientists. We are often more focused on the day-to-day of managing fisheries without stepping back and thinking about the governance structure within which we're doing that management. So many exciting ideas, and I'm happy to be here. So we mentioned, a couple of the speakers mentioned already that fisheries are a classic commons problem, where the interests of the individuals run counter to the interests of the group. The individual has an incentive to overexploit, and the group, of course, suffers from that overexploitation. And so there's a lively academic debate about how to solve the commons problems through governance. And one thread of that debate is roughly along the axis of whether top-down or bottom-up approaches are best. And of course, any dichotomous debate like that, the answer is probably it depends on the situation. I want to talk a little bit about how it might depend. So first, just to set up the problem with respect to renewable natural resources, this is the classic Gordon bioeconomic model. It's often used for fisheries, but it could represent any renewable natural resource, where when individuals first start harvesting a natural resource, the cost of increased harvest increases linearly, but the benefits they get from that increase at a much more rapid rate. And so this draws additional harvest pressure. And for the economically rational sole owner, which I think only exists in economics textbooks, he or she would stop right here, where the rate of increase in benefits is equal to the rate of increase in cost, right? Almost none of our commons problems, well, none of our commons problems by definition are sole owner issues. And so we end up over here where costs and revenues cancel out. That looks like a harmless spot on a graph here, but what that really means is everybody's starving and the environment is suffering. That's a horrible situation. It's not a situation of debate. Nobody wants to end up in that area over there. And so for fisheries, the question is how do we solve that? And there are some solutions. The governance question is fundamentally about who gets to decide how much, how, and where to fish or harvest the natural resource. I want to take a second here to do a poll of you guys. It's a little tongue-in-cheek. Who would vote for A, a faceless bureaucrat in a distant city? It's a top down. B, the invisible hand of the market. Or C, the people who are closest to the system and have the most to gain or lose. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. My point here is that we often let ideology decide what level of governance is best. And I think that's fundamentally problematic. And I think as scientists, all of us, we should be looking more toward theoretically and empirically grounded ways of answering these questions. And I just want to take the perhaps unfashionable point of view of arguing for the faceless bureaucrat. Nobody ever argues for the faceless bureaucrat. Yeah, great. So I think of these three options, federal fishery management in the U.S. is quite top down. I know some of the bureaucrats, they're not entirely faceless. They operate from distant cities, and they don't have a direct stake in this. Of course, depending on how you phrase these, this could be a self-interested fisherman who's trying to get rich off of common resource. So let's take a look here at the effects and the performance record of federal fishery management in the U.S. It's actually pretty good. I think this is not widely appreciated in common discourse about fisheries. A lot of the talk that we have about fisheries really is talking about fisheries the way we might talk about water quality problems before the Clean Water Act. A lot has changed, and it's not widely realized. So in the U.S., the Magnuson-Stevens Act was originally in 1976. This is on the graph here, the median biomass relative to the biomass at maximum sustainable yield. Essentially, it's the target. If we want to be maximizing yield, we want most of our fisheries around here. So it starts out pretty high. That's because we simply didn't have the technology to overexploit very widely back in the 50s. In 1976, the original Magnuson-Stevens Act comes into play, and if you look at the trend in abundance fish populations, I don't really see much of an intervention there. It basically continues to go down. That's because this wasn't the point of the 1976 Magnuson-Stevens Act. It was to kick out the Russians from what we thought of as our waters. It was to, as Cymie was talking about before, reduce the space of the high seas and create national jurisdiction over areas that had previously been high seas. So that didn't have much effect. But the 1996 reauthorization really marks an inflection point in the Magnuson-Stevens Act. I'll talk a little bit about why that is in a second here. 2006, it was reauthorized as well. This added some good features, but fundamentally it kind of continued the same trend. The 1996 reauthorization was really key here. This same pattern is not true in lots of other parts of the world. So this is a fairly unique feature of the U.S. federal fisheries legislation. So why is that? What are the strengths of the Magnuson-Stevens Act? I think, first of all, as Cymie was alluding to before, there's a fairly clear separation between what is the realm of scientific decision-making and what are the policy decisions that are based in part on that science, but also on a lot of other considerations. And I think this separation is really useful because it means that debates are based on a common set of facts, as opposed to everyone arguing, bringing in their own science. And that's because the Magnuson-Stevens Act says that all decisions must be based on best scientific information available. Of course, that raises the question, what is best scientific information and who the heck gets to decide it? But then it also specifies quite specifically that each council shall develop annual catch limits, and those may not exceed the fishing level recommendations of its scientific and statistical committees. The councils are legally bound to follow this advisory committee's recommendations, which is really interesting. I think, I'm sure we all serve on lots of advisory committees. It's not often where the people that we're giving advice to are then legally handcuffed by those decisions. This has been effective. One of the main things that was made it effective is in 1996, that reauthorization made overfishing illegal. So before that, the councils could decide, yes, based on the science that we've been given, this level of harvest would result in overfishing, but we think it needs to happen anyway. That's just off the table anymore. If the scientific and statistical committees, based on the information that they get from NOAA and NIMS, say that level of harvest would be overfishing, the councils cannot set it higher than there. And it's in a probabilistic framework. Everything about fisheries is known with a whole lot of uncertainty. It's kind of the opposite of what Karen was saying about sea level rise, where you can see it. Everyone, we can't see it at all, and there's tons of natural variability. So it's all in a probabilistic framework. And then finally, one of the strengths is for stocks that do become depleted, whether through overfishing that we didn't expect or simply natural variability, there's a requirement for recovering them within 10 years. Previously, there was a requirement to reduce fishing pressure, but that just doesn't kick the can down the road. Okay. One of the additional things that's going to get a little bit nerdy for a second here that has really worked out for fisheries management. This is not unique to the U.S. It's characteristic of most successful fisheries management programs now. There's something called harvest control rules, where basically we admit that we have very limited control over the state of the resource. It fluctuates naturally for all sorts of reasons. And we're going to pre-negotiate the management response to some change in the state of the resource. So instead of information coming in saying that the fishery is down this year, and then we start arguing about what to do, we will have pre-negotiated the response. And that makes fishery management much more responsive. You have all of those arguments up front. And these harvest control rules, this group is about the Anthropocene and the unique challenges. Those harvest control rules are a key location where climate information can be brought in and say, okay, this is a harvest control that worked in the past. How do we have to change that with respect to potential climate impacts? And so it looks something like this, where some observable variable, like fish abundance, you can roughly observe that in surveys, tells us what the management response should be in terms of the harvest rate that we allow. So when fish abundance is high, according to our surveys, we set it at this predefined standard target level. And then that fishing rate gets ramped down as fish abundance gets lower. If fish abundance gets down here, well, for some reason that wasn't working for us. And so we respond by lowering fishing pressure. The intercept is also positive, so you shut off fishing before zero abundance. That's a critical factor. And so I really think that this pre-negotiating of the response is responsible for a lot of the success of fishery management programs. Okay, key challenges for maintaining that success. One of which is coming to a head right now, is there is no clearly defined mechanism for reallocating access to fish as populations shift. So populations have been shifting dramatically. A lot of Malin Pinsky's work has shown this. The fish that are present off of New Jersey are not the same fish that were present 20 years ago. In the Gulf of Maine, they're seeing species that have never been there before. And in fact, they've become so abundant that they are potentially reducing the abundance of species they really care about. Black sea bass are up there now and are eating lobster, juvenile lobster. So it's not just that they have new species, new opportunities, but without access to those fish, they're also creating problems. And this is, I think, best exemplified by fishermen from North Carolina fishing off the coast of New Jersey, because the fish used to live off of North Carolina. Those fishermen in North Carolina had the quota, but the fish are now up in New Jersey. Another key challenge in the Trump era is stakeholders working outside the framework to achieve preferred policies. And there's a number of good examples of this. I'll use one that hits close to home. New Jersey, a couple of years ago, decided that they didn't like the changes required to summer flounder recreational fisheries. They were going to have to raise the minimum size limit, which meant that most fish caught would have to be discarded. And so, under a provision called conservation equivalency, they proposed that they would use regulations that would achieve an equivalent amount of harvest. The problem was they had no evidence to suggest that it would result in an equivalent amount of harvest. It was all based on the idea that a public education program would result in lower discards and higher survival of released fish. But they had never done this program before. And so the governing body said, no, that's, you have to demonstrate that it's equivalent. And so they said, well, we're going to do it anyway. and so it went to the Secretary of Commerce, who ruled, go ahead. I think this is the most damaging thing to that framework. Every other state took notice of that and said, if New Jersey's not bound by these rules that we've all been bound by, why the heck should we be bound by them in the future? And so that undermining of the regulatory framework, I think, is one of the most damaging things. Loss of confidence in science is another one, and I think I'm going on a little long, so I'm going to stop there on that one. I think we'll probably have more discussion about loss of confidence in science. Thanks.
Happy to be here. Hope everything goes well. So I want to tell you a little bit about a transnational research project that I've been a part of in Cuba. So it's kind of a sensitive and I hope interesting topic. So as we've been discussing so far, and you can read from the brochure, our understanding of the differences between government and governance has evolved over the past few years. So let me give you a quick and dirty definition. So government is a set of formal institutions that have regulatory or statutory power to develop and implement policies. Governance, on the other hand, is a little bit more open, it's a little bit more inclusive, and it includes governments, but it also includes NGOs, communities, societies, civil and social organizations, group interests, etc., etc. So governance can be defined as a dynamic network of different actors, and exactly as Karen was saying, governance transcends what we can call national and international boundaries. So going back to a little bit to what Karen was pointing out as one of the problems that we're seeing now, increasingly in the area of sustainability, we're seeing approaches that are drifting towards the global. What does it mean is that it may create some obstacles when we're thinking about what are the local impacts of climate change. So a way of answering that problem is transnational place-based research. I know it's a mouthful, but basically it's based on the collaboration of different scientists from different countries that are working together towards a common goal, and they select multiple field sites that are complementary. So research that is carried out on one place and research that is carried out on a second place can be compared, and some results can be scalable. So that is kind of a way of solving this problem with global sustainability. So I want to show you why this case study is particularly suited to transnational place-based research. So what you're seeing here is the Gulf of Mexico. And what you're seeing right there is the loop current. So that current connects everything that happens in the Gulf to Cuba and to the US. So whatever Cuba does on the Gulf, it affects the States and Mexico. And whatever Mexico and the States do on the Gulf, it affects Cuba. So you can see that there's a high interconnection between the two of them. And this is showing how important it is to think about strategies that are unified and not fragmented. That's why this approach to place-based transnational research is a way of trying to find common bridges of communication. So another really powerful reason why we should be having the conversations and developing these partnerships is pretty much right there. So you can see Hurricane Harvey happened on the 26th of August, and probably like 10 days after you have Irma hitting Cuba. So not only we're facing similar challenges, but there's expertise, for example, from the US in dealing with some of these problems, and there's expertise from Cuba in dealing with some of these problems. And you can see that on the numbers of deaths that you have. Cubans only had 10 people passing away. In the States, it's 106 so far. But there's really important losses from not engaging in these kinds of partnerships. So I want to show you a typical slide that shows the different models to consider sustainability. So I think some people are going to disagree with me, probably Gio, but in the States, mostly us, we are considered a weak type of sustainability. And the difference between these two charts is that if you look at the 3 dimensions, this is work. So if you look at the 3 dimensions, it's only in this area that we're actually meeting the 3 pillars of sustainability. On the other hand, Cuba, it's a little bit more advanced. After the Soviet collapse in 1992-91, Cuba took a really strong commitment towards developing a sustainable local development approach. It is said widely in 2006, WWF considered Cuba the only country that was actually reaching the Human Development Index. There's all kinds of indicators that speak to sustainability in Cuba. So what is new about this approach is that while Cuba places environment on a center, it also considers the importance of people, social justice, a bunch of other things related to equity when they are developing their model of sustainability. So this model of sustainability is based on like 3 different elements that I identified. So basically, as Karen was saying, there's a huge movement towards processes of territorial reorganization of the landscape and spatial planning. So Cuba started this in the early 90s, and unlike other places, they involve the communities in the planning and assignation of different zones. So communities were responsible for carrying out a SWOT analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of the different land uses that they could do, and the different resource allocations and things like that. Another element that was critical is Unidades Básicas de Producción Cooperativa. These are the classic co-ops. They came about in 1993. They are mostly agricultural. The co-op is actually a socio-economic community that has the ownership of the means of production, and they do communal production. But they are pretty much, while they have a lot of autonomy in terms of how they regulate and organize themselves, they are still subjected to some levels of state control. And this is one of the points that I want to make. So the final point why sustainability is particularly like it is in Cuba is a strong support that the country puts on the development of local networks. And this is where local communities meet economic alternatives, and those alternatives are based on science and technological innovation. So this is kind of a crossroads where all these different elements come together and they get implemented through these processes of territorial reorganization. And what I put right here is a meeting that just happened in Havana, that is a conference based on local development. So you can see the level of commitment that the government has to this particular model of development. So there are important lessons that we can get from working transnationally in this cooperation. But at the same time, it begs the question whether we're seeing actually governance or government in this particular situation. So, and this is a point that I want to make. So we may see different sets and management strategies based on the kinds of resources that we're dealing with. So that was the point that some of my colleagues mentioned before. But this model of sustainability is not applied across all sectors. So when you go and look at fisheries, there's a new law that got just approved by Cuba and is about to get implemented. The law is mostly considering centralization of fisheries, so it's going completely against some of the trends in policy that talk about decentralizing and the local development movement that is about decentralizing. And one example of that is that from now on, the decisions about where to fish, the areas of fishing, and the number of licenses that are going to be given each year are going to be defined by the higher ministry, by the highest Council of Ministers. So you can see how high up that decision process is going to go. So pretty much overlapping with what Cymie was saying, and there wasn't any kind of communication before that, I guess we have the same problem, right? So what kind of architecture, institutional architecture we need to develop so we can support these transactional efforts? And this is kind of the question that I want to actually put to the audience as a way to conclude. So one final comment that I want to make is that the devastating impacts of Irma, Harvey, and Maria, they show us that there's really a need to work together. So science diplomacy is actually a way of doing that. But we have to be really aware of the conditions in which we're working related to the Trump administration. So I will leave it at that. Thank you so much.
There was coordination. Yeah, we're also kind of like,
I feel like I should cut myself short because I just want to get to the discussion and the discussants. But I had prepared remarks, and I have a few projects that look at governance in the Anthropocene, and one is on long-term risk governance and under what conditions we might address future risk, and this is with Bob Kopp. And also Cymie Payne and I have worked on solar radiation management under how we might engage publics and make decisions about solar radiation management. But in this setting, I thought I would talk about my work on non-governmental organizations. As Karen mentioned, kind of the view on governance now is that we often see it as networks of not just the of state, but also non-state actors, and NGOs are a very important part of this. And my work has looked at how NGOs seek to change governance when it isn't working to address the problem they have. And so this field is a group set up around innovation and governance, right? And as we talk about the challenges of the Anthropocene to all these forms of governance, we need to think about how we might transform them or change them to address these challenges. And not only is the Anthropocene kind of providing new environmental problems, but also our current institutions are changing and potentially weakening, right? And not addressing the problems we need them to. And so this is the problem the NGOs I studied worked with, in that they were advancing energy goals around energy efficiency in the US, more recently looking at international NGOs working in China, right? And how when the routes to pursue the institutional, governance routes to pursue their goals are blocked, what do they do, and how do they innovate, right? And so my work found a few things, right? That they perceive changing political context in which they're working in, and that they're not achieving their goals. And there's several things they do, right? So sometimes they've looked to kind of, actually you mentioned a little bit about going around governance, right? The current structure. Sometimes this has involved in energy efficiency, kind of cutting out the state. So the Department of Energy is involved, and so NGOs would go directly to industry, engage them, negotiate something outside the regulatory process. bring it back to Congress, ask Congress to introduce it, right? And you just cut out all that process, the governance that is there is incredibly time consuming and burdensome, and so they just cut that out, right? And sometimes even it's this really interesting kind of quasi-regulatory, because they'll even have somebody in the room kind of running the test that DOE, the Department of Energy, would run, kind of giving it like the thumbs up or the thumbs down, right? And the models and the efficiency, cost savings, all the things you would need to meet to pass it, right? But they just negotiated outside that. And in doing that, they are forming these kind of cross-sectoral partnerships and changing the network of the governance, right? Because now they're working directly with business. And so another important thing I found NGOs do is what I call performing legitimacy, right? So legitimacy can be understood when an organization's values, it's seen to align with the society and cultural expectations they're working in, they're conforming to the norms. All groups face kind of having to meet different expectations for legitimacy, right? So environmental NGOs have to be legitimate to both their environmentalist audience, but also the partners, the industry partners they're trying to engage with. In China, the international NGOs have a different problem of engaging the Chinese government in meeting standards to ensure their legitimacy there through the state to be able to stay, but also ensuring their international home that they are legitimate and not totally co-opted and meeting and still being able to push effectively what they're there for, right? And so this idea of performing legitimacy and the way they adhere to cultural norms, and one fellow put it, right, that those environmentalists, they came in with suits and ties and they spoke that economic language, and it conferred that they knew how, right, to conform to our rules and engage us. As they do that, they've performed legitimacy, they've kind of cut out the state often. As they do that, they also will create new, kind of build on existing governance institutions for efficiency. It's around mandatory standards and then voluntary programs, things like Energy Star, right? These kind of voluntary certifications, market programs are all kind of new forms of governance. And what they've done is managed to link these, what were previously kind of separate forms of governance together, right? So Department of Energy, regulatory rulings, very long, burdensome. Energy Star ran through the Environmental Protection Agency, oriented around consumer products and outreach. And they linked these. They started negotiating with industry around these and saying, like, okay, so let's negotiate this Energy Star level, and let's say that in 5 years this is going to become the new standard. And can we do that now? Right now, there's nothing in the law officially that says that's what happens, right? But they started to negotiate this way and kind of linking these different things together, which ties to another thing they did, which is kind of creating an overall frame for action that engaged all partners and didn't just lean on kind of one form of governance. And so in the efficiency industry, it was the idea of market transformation, because it allowed all the different actors to see where they fit and coordinate, because what market transformation says is first you go in and you prime the consumers and you get producers to produce the products you want, and you increase the market, and it's all a voluntary kind of process. And then at the end, once there's things on the market and people are okay, you go in and you pass a regulation and you lock those final savings into place, right? And so, and everybody, you could stop having debates about should it be voluntary or should it be regulatory or should it be top-down or bottom-up or consumer versus producer, right? And they kind of managed to build this big umbrella frame, right, where everybody could kind of act, and you could see how these different governance regimes link together. And so I guess, as we go forward, we will, thinking about, nobody spoke, but I know NGOs are very important in all these processes, going forward and thinking about what the drivers of change as we need new institutions or new forms of governance, or to kind of reform old forms of governance, what will drive that, and what are some of the tactics that groups will use. So with that, I'm the last person. And I'd like to give all our speakers a round of applause. I assume you wish. And now, did you guys decide upon an order for yourselves? Anybody want to go first? Okay. So I'll invite David up here.
Is there like an expectation for what we're supposed to be doing?
Basically, we wanted the next generation of
Yeah.
graduates to
Just be
bring
really
governance
smart.
issues
Right.
across
Give us the
different
answers
Tell
to
us,
the questions
tell
we
us why
posed.
we're wrong.
Right. So David Eisenhauer is from the Department of Geography and has worked with human ecology faculty as a TA, and we'll get the perspective from him. And then Holly Berman will be speaking as well. She's at the Blaustein School, also has worked worked with human ecology professors, and then Abigail Golden, who is in ecology and has worked with Olaf and me a little bit as well on ecosystem services. So we've got hopefully a really interesting dynamic of people from different departments. So maybe 5 minutes apiece or so.
Sure, okay, yeah. So I'll just maybe start with a general comment, and then maybe have a specific comment for each presentation. And so I guess to start off, I want to start with the concept of the Anthropocene, and I think really until Rachel, it's kind of not really addressed. It was mostly the governance side of things. Olaf briefly mentioned the Anthropocene. And so, how does the Anthropocene matter is sort of, I guess, the question that I would have. And particularly thinking about sort of governance institutions. So if we take the Anthropocene narrative, at face value, right, it's not just a difference of degree, it's not just a institution of human impacts, right, it's a step change, it's something fundamentally new, in which the past is no longer represented in the future. And if it's fundamentally new, then how do we look at these past institutions that have developed over time to manage environments? That are they still valid in the future? And so there's this really interesting book came out 2 years ago by Orrin Young. Probably most people are familiar with Orrin Young. For the past 50 years, he's been writing about environmental institutions, and we probably group them in that sort of Eleanor Ostrom school of thought, where these institutions they developed over time, and they're generally pretty good. In his last book, where he engaged with the Anthropocene, basically to simplify it, a 200-page book, he's like, actually, they're no longer that good, right? The Anthropocenes can totally upset our institutional arrangements, right? And we can think about this partially as a knowledge problem, right? Where the future is now very uncertain, and deeply uncertain is sort of the way that we talk about it right now. We don't know the timing, the extent, the form of climate impacts, when will it happen, how they'll interact, and so we need to, at least Orrin Young argues, right? We need to develop new sort of transformed institutions. And a lot of times we talk about robust institutions now, that are robust against a range of plausible features, that are flexible, they're adaptive, and so forth. And so we have a lot of theories about these new institutions. We don't have a lot of examples of them being implemented, and this is, again, just the knowledge question, right? How do we produce, and I think this is what a lot of the presentations got to, right? How do we produce the knowledge that informs the creation of these new institutions? And it turns out, again, if you look at the literature, right, you need long-term iterative interactions between scientists and policymakers and so forth. And to cut things short, basically what that means is, well, we need new institutions to produce these new forms of knowledge that will then lead us to create new institutions. So we kind of have a circular problem here. And ultimately, right, I think to get out of that circular problem where we need new institutions for the new knowledge that will help us develop new institutions, we have to think about things a little bit more politically, and thinking about what are maybe the social movements that can be the resources and the forces behind breaking out of that sort of loop. So, and then sort of, I guess, maybe on presentations then, so like Karen was talking about retreat, and one of the, I think Karen's really great points was that like there's not a lot of novelty. I think that was one of Karen's really interesting observations, and so things tend to be very reactive. And I think the small island developing states, though, kind of is a nice counterexample of that, where they're talking now about dignified retreat ability to move their entire population to the mainland. And also the way that small island developing states really rally around the 1.5 degree target. So I think, what are other examples maybe of social movements where sort of manned retreat becomes a way of thinking about international justice issues, and how might that emerge in, say, places like New Jersey? So Cymie, I think also, I don't know a lot about Aziz. That was a super interesting presentation. But I think it kind of gets to this question of the best science informing sort of institutional design, and are those institutions still the sort of conventional institutions, and can the best science really inform international level? I think it seems very complicated, but do we have to think that institutional structure, does that have to be also completely thought, and how does that happen at the international level, and sort of the social movements around sort of this high seas? Olaf, one of the things that I was thinking about with your presentation is how are these sort of maximized sustained yields even feasible in the Anthropocene, right? Is that the right way? So you talked about climate information being brought in there, but climate information is so uncertain that is it the point now that we can't really talk about maximum yield, but maybe the most sufficient yield that's robust against all these range of possible futures? And how does that get implemented? Like, who are your three actors in groups before? It seems like all three of them will have to be involved. So I don't, again, fisheries aren't my thing, but it seems like that might be a thing to think about. Victoria, unfortunately, ended on my question. So my question is basically your question. And I guess for Rachel, my question was thinking about NGOs as the drivers of change. And at one point, you talk about sort of NGOs performing legitimacy, and I wonder if that, in some ways, it seems it's obviously a resource in driving change, but also I wonder to what extent does that become change, because legitimacy makes sense in current arrangements, right? Being legitimate to what currently exists. So beyond sort of NGOs as drivers of change, like how do NGOs, how does that legitimacy both facilitate social movements, whether it's racial justice or economic justice, what have you? How does that legitimacy both facilitate, but how might it also sort of prevent some type of transformative change? I think I did everyone. Okay. Oh, Pam, my committee member. Which is, so, Pam, wonderful.
That's right.
I think the first, actually, I had two questions for Pam. The first is thinking, well, what does the Anthropocene then mean to how you assess ecosystem services? You have the whole host of things, but ways of assessing, but thinking forward, how does that uncertainty really affect that? And then the second one was thinking about, I guess, the Southeast Asia context, which again gets into this question of like kind of thinking about how they're being inserted into this context. One is inserted into these existing governance arrangements, but the other is, are there local alternatives that this movement could, or ecosystem services might amplify? And as someone straddling the critical social sciences and the ecosystem services community, right, how do you navigate that tension of maybe working in the existing governance as well as finding sort of maybe some alternative movements that are basically
Hey guys, I'm Holly. Thank you, Pam, for introducing us. This has been wonderful, definitely for me, because I'm familiar with a lot of human ecology faculty I have done in the past, but to get this update on what everybody's working on currently is really, really interesting. I work with Rachael on looking at household consumption for food, energy, and water. But I think the work that I've done that most aligns with governance is work that I did last summer working with the Bar Service on their stewardship mapping and assessment project. And so basically that project looks at stewardship organizations, which they define as groups that can be NGOs, can be private, and can kind of span that whole range, but that engage in acts of caretaking and claims making on the environment. And they really do this whole host of functions. So they do the survey, they did it in 2007 and they did it again in 2017 in New York, and they were able to compare across time and see kind of how these groups were doing and how they were changing. And one thing that they saw a lot, and that how they all engage in this larger governance process, is that over time there have been this huge increase in small-scale and local stewardship groups in the New York City area and region, and that a lot of these groups kind of move past just the functions of improvement or management and move into a more systems-level transformation where they're actually focusing on food systems, energy systems, water systems, and they're kind of taking these small-scale neighborhood-level actions, but accumulated, they kind of scale up and start to push larger systems. And so a lot of this is transforming the environment through the social sphere. So I was kind of thinking about that a little bit during the presentations. And for Karen, I have absolutely no evidence for this, but I think that when I think about managed retreat, that concept seems so far off or so impossible in how people think about it. But I think that local kind of stewardship organizations who are working in these communities might present the best kind of opportunity to present that idea and to start the coordination, because what we're seeing is the faceless bureaucrat not being able to coordinate that. So that might be, and you can kind of see that in communities, in coastal communities in New York that are having a lot of problems, and that with sea level rise, with climate change, and that a lot of them answered the survey that were these small local groups saying, yes, we were driven by ecosystem disturbance, by climate, by sea level rise, by all of these different small problems, to kind of just start doing these small things in their community. The other thing I'm really interested in that I felt like everybody really addressed is that intersection between science and policy, and I've been trying to engage with that as much as I can. In studies, kind of like there's, now science communication is starting to be its own field, and there's lots of workshops and great opportunities. But a couple of you used the term institutional architecture, which I thought was really interesting. And I'm trying to think about what role there is for connections to be built within that institutional architecture between scientists and policymakers. So with that stewardship organization data, I'm working on a paper to try to think more deeply about how can we connect planners and stewardship organizations, because I'm over in the planning school. So that how can they leverage each other's resources? How can they work together to kind of communicate in the same language, on the same playing field, bring different stakeholders in, and push some of these projects forward. So yeah, this was super wonderful, and thank you guys.
All right, I will try to be brief. I'm just going to say a couple thoughts that I had listening to the talks today, and I also want to echo what Olaf was saying about being very grateful to be here. I spend most of my time in the ecology and marine sciences departments. I don't get a lot of chance to see what you guys in human ecology are working on, and I'm very excited about strengthening some of those connections. I want to say first that one of the major themes and threads that I saw here, I think, was expressed really eloquently by Dr. Payne about this idea of needing governance institutions to be both constrained and rigorous, and strong and enforceable, but also flexible enough to deal with the challenges that we're about to start facing and already are facing. And I think maybe not everybody expressed that in so many words, but I think that was kind of the central tension in a lot of the talks that we've just heard. And I think that is kind of where the Anthropocene becomes really important, because one of the major issues of the Anthropocene is that change is going to start accelerating. And that flexibility is going to become even more important, but so is rigor and constraint. And there are some really inherent trade-offs there that I think are a really difficult line to thread. And I'm excited to see so many people in the room thinking about how those trade-offs might play out in various situations. Another thought that I had kind of reflects my own biases, which I think, well, we've talked a lot about governance structures and governance institutions. What I thought was missing was thinking about the people in the communities that are subject to governance and government. And how do they feel about that, and how do they respond to that, and how do people participate in governance? And this is at the forefront of my mind right now, because I just got back from South Jersey, where I've been doing focus groups with recreational fishermen about the management for recreational bottom fish species in New Jersey, which is a hugely contentious subject. And these are people who are very engaged in the governance and the government project. They're advisory members, they're advisory panel members for a lot of these governing bodies, for the management councils that Olaf's involved in, for state level agencies, for all kinds of organizations. They're very, very active in trying to influence governance. And they're also very, very frustrated. And I think that's something that we need to pay attention to, especially as change starts accelerating and as the avenues maybe for bypassing our traditional forms of governance are multiplying in some ways, for political reasons, for reasons just relating to the degree of chaos and globalization and teleconnection between really broad-scale systems. So I think that brings us to a second theme that I saw in a lot of the talks today, which was the problem of scale. And at what scale are we thinking about governance, and at what scale is it actually happening? And I think the answer is every scale. But that's really, really, really hard to think about and manage. And that's really all I have to say.
From the landscape architecture. So Jill said something about the disaster and recovery and resilience, and so I have been listening to Naomi Klein twice in the Institute for Research on Women in the last 3 months. She's now the new Gloria Steinem chair, and so she works a lot about disaster capitalism and effects of climate change, and the new research is now on the Green New Deal. So it's more about policy making. But what I found extremely challenging from her research, and it was really new for me, as also coming new to this country, is that she basically said that the disaster is only really showing what is already layered in injustice. And so the climate change, it will especially affect poor people, indigenous people, people of color, and so she really presented it very beautifully. And so my question would be, how important is this question in your approaches and research? And also a suggestion would be, I think it would be fantastic to connect with her. I mean, then you get really into politics because she's really working on the Green New Deal. But I think like Rutgers has really this strength to address exactly these issues. So I would be really very interested to hear how this is like overlapping with your work on governance.
Hi, I'm Peter Anderson. I'm in SEB's IT services, so not in human ecology or in the science department. But I've thought about this a lot, and One thing, climate change, global warming is an aspect of the Anthropocene. Well, what about global informing, right? I mean, we have this new environment called big data, and we're generating lots and lots of data. And existing governmental structures can't metabolize that data, right? They react defensively against that data, right? So it's like in the early Earth, the oxygen crisis, right? The oxygen was generated, and it was originally toxic to living things. But then new forms evolved to take advantage of that oxygen. So perhaps new forms of governance will evolve to operate in an information-rich environment. And government structures that evolve to live in a relatively information-poor environment. And if you think of the Middle Ages, all the books, all the information were in monasteries. So I think we're seeing an evolution of new structures, which will be characteristic of the Anthropocene because of big data. So it's just something I've been thinking about. So.
Hi, I'm another faceless bureaucrat. No, I know a few of you. Rick Garfunkel, originally from chemistry, now in charge of something called Rutgers Global. So it's always a great pleasure for me to see and hear about, another silo of the Rutgers 1,000 silos. And this is one I knew a little bit about. I mean, I know Bob, and he's sort of the executive dean who cares most about grand global challenges, sustainable goals, UN SDGs, etc. And so hearing the discussion about 3 or 4 or 5 of those in one location and thinking about policy is great. The connection of what you guys are doing, both doing it and living it in New Jersey, whether it's on farms or in the rivers or in the near shore, yet thinking about the global solutions and being present at the UN and working on policy is interesting, local versus global. I mean, my general thinking right now, these are global problems, global solutions have to be. So yes, solutions, people are going to have to work at the local level, but big thinking might, for many of these problems, has to be done globally. Where else, the fact that you're bringing in others from Rutgers, I think is very important, and I'm happy to see that you're going to Blaustein and other units within Rutgers, SAS or engineering or whatever, to solve some of these problems. I think is important for the local discussion. Bringing people into Rutgers as you do regularly and having a presence on as many global forums as you can, Cuba or wherever it happens to be, is important and exciting to hear about. Our own unit is happy to support this when you go out there, if we can, to help make partners for you, because in many places they actually already exist. One unit of SEBS doesn't even know about the other unit of SEBS, which is already doing things, and sometimes Bob knows, and sometimes he doesn't even know, and someone from my office knows about that, so we're happy to help on that front. So again, keep it up. Oh, another thing is, it's not just the assistant professors. Do we still have that rule where you can't hire the graduate students, or are you allowed to for faculty later? You have these great graduate students.
Hey, Bob Kopp. Great talks, and wonderful to hear all of this. I'm thinking about questions that Cymie was raising about the role of the scientific institutions, and Olaf came in as well. So we were all studying these sort of systems of governance, or you all are studying them. What's the role, or either the potential role in different case studies around the world, or actual role, the role of universities, not just as observers, but as players within environmental governance? Are there interesting examples of that people have come across? I mean, I think particularly probably Cuba there might be, but more broadly.
So first, I don't want to advertise my so it was conceived like that. So science for policy making. So science informing policy. So many of the things that we were doing were engaging with the government. And that's why working in Cuba is problematic, because the government is behind everything, and with the new administration, we're not allowed to engage with them. So there's a lot of subtleties with that. But yeah, it happens. I mean, there's a lot of institutions, like university institutions, that have policy making as one of their, and they have customers on that. And I think we do here. I don't know.
I'll take it after you.
All right. And also, I just want to add to this idea, is because I hear this focus on how we use science in decision making, but I want to, I guess, provide a corrective for kind of making our governance very focused on kind of scientific imperial, and what we call imperialism, right, where science trumps everything or doesn't. What we need are governance institutions that integrate, scientific knowledge, but also the values of the people. And I think it was Abby that said about the communities, right, and what people want. And so it's really, I think, designing governance not just for kind of taking in scientific information and spitting out the right answer, but I mean, that's why politics is there, right, is to fight for what people want, as Karen teaches, for the good stuff, right? The fight for the good stuff. And so kind of putting in those, and that's why, something like the role of NGOs is important to me, because that's where things get inserted, hopefully from communities, but about what people are valuing in these processes. And so it's that integration of not just the scientific information, but the values with that I think is really important.
And to your question about the role of universities, in terms of top-down versus bottom-up governance, those decisions are generally made on the basis of ideology. And when they're made by NGOs, often they're made on the basis of what is hot now, what can they sell to donors. So it was community co-management for a while, not because community co-management has a great base of empirical information saying it is in these situations better than these other approaches, but because it was hot at the time. And I think universities can serve as a way of slowing down that process a little bit and taking a step back and saying, well, what is the empirical evidence base for the conditions under which this approach should be preferred to this one, without having that be driven by ideology.
I want to pick up on that with something that's been very troubling to me in the UN process, and that's become really super apparent. At the UN, there's a fund that is a voluntary fund so that delegations from places like Palau that are remote, it's incredibly expensive to get from there to New York City, and poor, can actually participate in the negotiation. There's never enough money in the fund, but at least there's some. And what I see over and over again is that when I try to get colleagues from Africa engaged and coming, it is a very heavy lift. So getting people from all the places that we work at, that we all know good people, but finding resources to bring those people together, and not always to bring them here, but to bring us all together to work together so that they are fully represented, I think is going to be really important in this.
There was one question about social vulnerabilities that I want to address, because I think one of the things that we often hear about in the Anthropocene is all the challenges and how difficult it's going to be. It's going to make already vulnerable people more vulnerable. But I also think there's some opportunities. And so in my work, for example, on ecosystem services, we as social scientists were worried that valuing ecosystem services would be homogenizing, and it would be the market running roughshod over local communities and so forth. But we're actually seeing the emergence of some local forms of governance around ecosystem services that are, I think, fairly encouraging. So I've been the special issue editor of a issue that's going to come out later this year, using case studies of where ecosystem services actually led to local organization in really interesting ways. And one of the papers was a graduate student who had worked in Guatemala, and the ecosystem services concept allowed indigenous landowners to actually get land rights, because they said, okay, you want us to protect ecosystem services, recognize us, and we'll do it. And so they use it as a leverage point to sort of get past some of their social vulnerabilities. So I think there's a lot of potential opportunities like that that we as university researchers can really highlight and show that there are some places where governance is working in new forms and is helping overcome those vulnerabilities.
So that brings me to the Seligman group.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
The CEO, co-founder of Conservation International, and his deep passion of interest today is in indigenous peoples, indigenous rights, the use it or lose it kind of ideas that Dan Jansen actually years and years ago promoted. So there's another connection with a global figure who could play a role in helping expand our vision.
So one thing I'd like to talk about is that we've talked about innovation, and we've also talked a lot about NGOs and non-governmental actors. And I want to really emphasize something that I think would resonate for Cymie, which is that all these negotiations we've been talking about take place in the context of state power. And so if we think about when do parties come to settlements, it's under the threat of a lawsuit, right? Or under the threat of potential regulation. So the aspects that Rachael was pointing out about like energy efficiency standards, oftentimes corporations are willing to do this because they don't want to be regulated. They have a reasonable expectation that regulation is going to come. And so we saw this like with fuel efficiency standards. California would set the standard, and then it would be adopted by New Jersey, or air pollution standards. Then New Jersey and other states would develop them, and then the federal government. And that's of course, that's sort of stopped now. But I also want to point out that there's a really important aspect of NGOs, and that is that they are not democratic. Yeah. And this has been a really important thing at the international level. International governmental organizations are not democratic, and non-governmental organizations are not democratic. That is, they do not respond to a broad public constituency. They are not accountable in ways that governments are. And so I think that also cut across every one of the talks, including the graduate students' talks. So innovation's great, but I think that we really have to keep in mind where are the regulatory powers. And I think, the fisheries, this is why the fisheries keep coming up, right? I mean, what Cymie said, how limited the states are involved. They can regulate their ships. And that's really where we're at. I mean, what's happening on the moon? What's happening in outer space? All of these things, right? So I would just really keep in mind that it's an odd thing, because we think of NGOs as being, really great, innovative, whatever. But I think what you bringing up, that, and actually Bob was saying as well, they can be models, they can present models, but can we rely on them given the faddishness, right? I mean, a lot of these fads come out of foundations, for example, right? So we just have, the Rockefeller is just finishing up with 100 resilient cities. And a lot of people are like, good.